This third video continues with the funeral of Mrs Teresa Newcomen and the end of that era. And the inheritance of the estate by Arthur Henry Turner Newcomen and so on until the hall was eventually demolished in 1956 or thereabouts. This is the grave of Arthur Newcomen. And it's also, although it's difficult to read, this is Mrs Newcomen, who died in 1887, his wife. So Teresa Newcomen was the last of the family to be buried here at Kirkleatham in 1887. The others all lived elsewhere and died elsewhere. And this is a little article about Mrs Newcomen, or Teresa van Sittert Newcomen's funeral. And the chief mourners were Mr Charles Newcomen, who was her son, and her daughter. This Lady Clementi was her daughter, Teresa Alice, and she was married to this Sir Cecil Clement Smith. He was an interesting character. He was the governor of the Straits Settlement, which is now Singapore, and he was instrumental in quelling Chinese secret societies which had been terrorising the area for hundreds of years, which made him very popular with the locals. He became the governor of Ceylon, which he is there. Ceylon, of course, now Sri Lanka. And he was still governor of Sri Lanka 10 years later, in 1897. And then in 1909 he was the chief British delegate at the International Opium Conference at The Hague. I don't know what that was about. And he attended St Paul's School. More of which later. And the number of children varies. Some said he had 2, a son and a daughter. Some said he had 2 daughters, but on his death, the West Australian newspaper reported that he had 7 children. Anyway, I can only find 3. Arthur, Hubert and Eustace. And Arthur also went to St Paul's School. This Miss Newcomen, I think, was her daughter-in-law, Rachel. She had been married to Arthur Henry Turner Newcomen, but he died before his mother. He died 3 years before his mother. And then his widow, 2 years later, she married this guy, Mr Charles Trotter, who became the sort of master of Kirkleatham Hall and all that went with it. A very lucky man. James Lowther, he was from Wilton Castle. Whartons were from Skelton Castle. Obviously there were people from the cottage hospital and then all the others from the estate. Who these people are, I have no idea. It was the end of an era in a big, big way. One of the anomalies I've come across is here. The youngest child, Eveline, her date of birth is given on certain documents as 1850. But her dad died in 1848. And she doesn't strike me as the kind of woman who would have had a child out of wedlock, especially at that age. So I suspect that this date is wrong. But I can find no evidence to confirm that. And she married another Clementi Smith. She married the brother of her brother-in-law. This fellow was a well-known soldier, as most of them seem to have been. They all seem to have gone into the army one way or another, being senior officers. I think he was a general, this fellow. Anyway, the estate passed to Arthur Henry Turner Newcomen. He married this Rachel Jervois, Clark Jervois of Ibsworth, Horndean, which is near Southampton. But as you can see here, he was only 40 years old when he died. And then after that, she married this fellow called Charles Trotter. And they continued, Charles Trotter and Rachel, they continued to live at Kirkleatham Hall. And he was at his mother-in-law's funeral. And they had 3 children, Muriel and Kathleen Teresa and this fella, Henry Gledow Turner Newcomen. And being the only male, when his father died, he inherited the estate. And he's only 7. So I suspect he continued to live with his mother and Charles Trotter at Kirkleatham Hall. At this point we'll have a look at a little video of various artefacts, well, mainly Christmas cards, which were found behind some panelling when Kirkleatham Hall was demolished in 1956. When Kirkleatham Hall was demolished, these cards had slipped down behind some panelling under a window. They're all Christmas cards. Some of them have messages on the back. This one is to Dear Gledow from Edie and Sess. This again to Master somebody from Schultz. Obviously a German name. And this one here to my little friend Gledow with loving wishes from his wifey. And this was in 1886. Again, this one just simply says, to Gledow. This is with Mansell's best wishes. This is for Gledow with love from, who's that, Auntie L. And again, I think that's with Warrington's loves to dear Master Gledow. So it must have been a very sad time for him. So this card is 1886. This is when his mother had remarried Mr. Charles Trotter, and they lived at Kirkleatham Hall with his grandmother, Mrs Teresa Newcomen, and she died the following year in 1887. Anyway, he seemingly didn't marry this fella. No children. And when he died, it would have been expected that his estate would have been inherited by Muriel as the oldest of his sisters, or the elder of his two sisters. But I can find no evidence of when she died. And because the estate passed to this girl, Kathleen Teresa Newcomen, I suspect that Muriel Newcomen died before 1932. When he died in Weymouth. So she was the only surviving relative, Kathleen Teresa Newcomen. And this is a plaque inside Kirkleatham Church following the death of Gledow Henry Turner Newcomen in 1932. About the church gates. It's difficult to read, so I've just when I went to get a better photograph of it, the church was closed, which is a sad sign of the times, I suppose. These gates are a memorial to Henry Turner Gledow Newcomen. He died in 1932. He was the owner of the Kirkleatham Hall estate. And the money was raised by subscription for these gates. And they were erected in 1934. And there's a plaque inside the church, a brass plaque, indicating that. He actually died in Weymouth. He didn't die up here in Kirkleatham. Her mother, Rachel, her family home was at Ibsworth in Horndean, which is down in Hampshire. And I suspect that they spent a lot of time down there with Sir Gervase Clark Jervois, or Jervois, or whatever it's called. Jervois. I suspect she spent time with Sir Jeremy Jervois, Clark Jervois, at this house in Ibsworth in Hampshire. And this Herman Leroy Lewis, he lived in Westbury House, which wasn't very far away, in Westmeath, again in Hampshire. And I suspect that down in Hampshire somewhere was where Kathleen Teresa Newcomen met this fella. And they lived in a grand house, Westbury House. Unfortunately, the whole place caught fire in 1904. And having sort of rescued the 5 children it mentioned. He rescued his 5 children. So there's a newspaper article on it. He rescued his 5 children, but had to get up onto the roof and then climb down a drain pipe to escape. And he rebuilt Westbury House, considerable place. But obviously it was a financial burden or financial strain, and whether he ran out of money or what, I don't know. But it was sold in 1918, and now, having sold this place in 1918, where did he go to? I don't know. Whether they came to live at Kirkleatham Hall, I have no idea. Because this fella here, his mother died in 1899 and his father died in 1912, so for 20 years he would have been at Kirkleatham Hall on his own, although the evidence would suggest that he didn't spend much time there. At one time he seems to have gone to America. But when he died in 1932, if not before, I suspect that they came to live in Kirkleatham Hall. Because she was certainly living there, or spending a lot of time there, just before her death in 1948. But I suspect they had relatives down in Hampshire, and they may even have bought a smaller property around a little place called Catherington. They seem to spend a lot of time at Catherington, which was where her mother was christened, Catherington Church. So whether they just came up to Kirkleatham and spent the summer there or spent a few months there, I don't really know. But when she left and died in 1949, the hall and the estate was all broken up and sold. I'm assuming that these 5 children which they had weren't interested in taking it on. It was in a dilapidated state. It wasn't a ruin, but it needed a fair amount of money spending on it. And if you're going to spend money, down in Hampshire was certainly a better prospect than up in the cold northeast of England. So, and that was the end of it. And another plaque inside Kirkleatham Church to the last chatelaine of Kirkleatham Hall. When she died, the whole place was sold. Having heard about the woman from people who knew her, I don't think she'd be very happy with the Leroy bit. It actually was le roi, in other words, in French, the king, le roi Louis. So Leroy wouldn't go down very well. I said in the earlier video that Kirkleatham Hall, when it was sold in 1949, was bought by Kirkleatham Estate, which was a sort of front, if you like. Jack Calvert, a young fellow, he was training horses on the family farm at Stainton, and they'd built a sort of track there which took up a fair amount of land which would have been better growing wheat on. And one of his owners was a Mr McEwen, who I think had a haulage business in County Durham somewhere. And he bought Kirkleatham Hall stables and grounds and set up Jack Calvert there as the trainer. away from the family farm, and they went to the sale together, Mr McEwen and Mr Calvert, and they paid what was described in those days as an astronomical sum. They paid £29,000 for it, which they thought was too much. And then in 1953-54, Mr McEwen decided that the hall, there was more money in demolishing the hall than in trying to sell it or rescue it in any way, and so they set about demolishing it. There was tons of lead in the place, absolute tons of the stuff. Above the laundry, between the two floors, were two massive lead water tanks. They must have been 15 feet long and about, I would imagine, 6 feet wide. And they were to hold soft water. It was soft water for the laundry. So I was reliably informed. And so this lead was all sold off, and it fetched £90 a tonne. I don't know what it is today, but it's a lot more than that. And everything else was auctioned off. Every last hinge, door, light fitting, floor, joists, windows, panelling, you name it. It was all sold off at auction. And a lot of it was bought by a chap who had a biggish house out at Thorpe Fuels. He bought a lot of the historical stuff, the sort of wooden panelling and doors and things. And then when all that had been taken out, I thought it had all just been shoveled away, so I was pleasantly surprised to find that it hadn't. People had bought this and taken it away in bits and pieces for their own use. And then at the end of it, lint scarfs who were based in the old pit yard at Eston. They had a sort of haulage demolition business. They came in and finished it off. They came away and finished all the brickwork and everything. But the cellars were a bit of a problem, especially when it came to building the new school, the special school. On one occasion, one of the machines dropped into a cellar which hadn't been filled in. The wheels sank into a big hole in the ground. So that's a little bit more detail about the sale of Kirkleatham Hall and its subsequent demise. Since the first video in Kirkleatham, some additional information has come my way, which is quite interesting, and so I'll just stick it on at the end here. I don't know what else to do with it. This is the stable block in 1949, when the hall was sold off. This is another view of Kirkleatham Hall from the south. This was in 1953, shortly before it was demolished. You can see, if you look closely, the garden's a bit of a wilderness. And this was taken in 1952. This is a horse called Clever Lass, trained by Jack Calvert. And the stable lass holding her is a girl called Hilda Redman. I think she was from somewhere out Broughton way in East Cleveland. And behind it you can see the south entrance of Kirkleatham Hall. When the hall was demolished, behind the panelling, not only were there Christmas cards for young Gledow Turner Newcomen, this photograph was found from the First World War when Kirkleatham Hall was being used as a hospital for wounded soldiers. You can see this chap here with his crutches. You can also see behind it the sort of a north entrance to Kirkleatham Hall, which sort of stood out. And you just see, just move it across a bit, you can see the one of the gate pillars, a little lion on the top, which are still there. And perhaps the most poignant of all of the bits and pieces found behind the panelling when the hall was demolished is this photograph of a chap called Private Coit. And in the back it gives this information. The important thing being that number 3837, Civil Service Rifles. So you can find a lot more information about him. And this is the final bit that was found behind the panelling under the windowsill. It actually tells you down the side what this is and who the photographer was. So this is a view of Kassel, if that's the correct pronunciation. It's in northern Hesse in Germany. And it was photographed by a photographer, professional photographer called Eugen Kegel, who lived from 1848 to 1901. So I suspect this was taken in the 1880s. Kegel was quite famous. He photographed the first German emperor when, after all these German states had been united. He photographed a guy called Wilhelm I. He was the first emperor of Hohenzollern, which is essentially the first emperor of Germany. In World War II, Kassel was absolutely flattened, and unlike many cities, it wasn't rebuilt to its old design. The whole place was rebuilt to a modern design, which upset quite a lot of people. And I think that the Newcomens had obviously been there for holidays or a visit some European aristocrats, or they may even have been there when this Wilhelm I was have coronations today for emperors, but anyway, they may have been there for his enthronement as the first emperor. Again, like a lot of history. Make up your own tale. In about 1955, under the floor of the upstairs rooms above the stables, this was found. It's of St Paul's School in London, and this is just typical entries for, this is 1879. It has lists of names and members. And then on the other side it has the expenditure bit. mappings, that's Mappings and Webb. The only link between this and the Turner Newcomens is in September 1883, when there is this entry here, Clementi Smith. There were two brothers, in fact there were more of them, I think there were about 9 children altogether, but anyway, two of the brothers married into the Newcomen family. In fact they married sisters. One brother married one sister and one brother married the other sister. One sister married Algernon Emerick Clementi Smith in 1871 in the Isle of Wight, and the other married Cecil Clementi Smith in 1869. He became quite famous out in the Far East. He was a sort of governor of places like Singapore and Hong Kong. There's a lot about him on the internet. And they both went to St Paul's School, and the Cecil Clementi Smith, his oldest boy went to St Paul's School, a lad called Arthur. He also went to St Paul's School. So who this refers to, I have no idea. And how it came to be in a ceiling cavity above the stables at Kirkleatham Hall, make up your own story. This is a drawing by Alec Wright of the Dovecote at Kirkleatham. It's the only picture I've been able to find of it. It certainly didn't look like that when I was a kid. It was just a great mass of stone. The outside towers were all tumbled down. The middle tower was intact. Contained thousands of, well, probably hundreds anyway, of little alcoves for doves to nest in. I thought they were for collecting the eggs and eating, but another account said that they were for shooting. And the local gentry from miles around would gather there for shooting and gambling. There's nothing better to do. And the pigeon droppings were collected again by people from miles around, for obviously for growing plants, but also used for tanning leather, I understand.